Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
I just want to thank you again, Kofi, for coming on to the podcast. And before we start, can I just have you just give a bit of history about yourself for the listeners?
Well, my name is Kofi Barima. I hold a PhD in Caribbean and African cultural history from the Howard University. I'm also the custodian for the Obinifo Busumfie, which is a traditional Akan shrine here in Jamaica. I've spent close to over 20 years traveling in and out of Ghana, West Africa, researching the traditional and cultural spirituality. The overall purpose of my research is to explain the ways that, African culture, let's put it this way, the ways in which Afro-Jamaican culture connects to
Yes.
various cultural sites on the African end. Today's area of Ghana is one of the main areas where the bulk of enslaved Africans were taken from and brought to Jamaica. Of course, throughout the West and Central African space, the peoples from those areas, they all are ancestors in a way of the Afro-Jamaican population. So you do have large bulks of enslaved Africans that were taken from what is today's Nigeria. So if you look like in Jamaica, you will notice that there are place names that sort of identifies that connection. So for example, you will see the word Nago across Jamaica. Nago was a designation utilized during the enslaved period to identify captive Africans of Yoruba extraction. Likewise, you see words like Bakra, Mbakra, all of those words identify that there were a large presence of Igbo-speaking peoples from today's Nigeria that entered into Jamaica. Also, you'll find, like there's a community named Moko. Moko was a terminology utilized during the transatlantic slave trade to identify captives from the Ibibio ethnic group, which is also another ethnic group from the Nigeria area. So in essence, the goal of my research is to establish the connections between various West and Central African sites to African cultural spiritualities in Jamaica.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. And going on that theme, so the origins of a lot of the Afro-Jamaicans under the Spanish rule and under the British rule. Can you just give us go through with that? Because I know you just discussed that in the paper.
Okay, yeah. One of the things that, a lot of people don't bear in mind is that, Jamaica had a Spanish colonial period, from the late 15th century when Columbus first arrived into the island till the mid 17th century. There was a period of Spanish rule. No, the Spanish did not necessarily establish large sugarcane plantation. There were a few, but the type of economic systems the Spanish mainly concentrated on were what they call ranches. So you'll find that a number of the captive Africans that were imported by the Spaniards into Jamaica, largely came from what is today what is today referred to as the Senegambian region. So in that early period, you tend to find amongst those captives a number of enslaved Africans referred to broadly as Mandingo. But Mandingo was a generic terminology utilized to refer to, captive Africans from the Senegambian space. This of course would include, the Fulanis, the Fula ethnic group, the Wolofs, and so forth. But Mandingo is a generic terminology that was utilized for that. Within that period also, you did find some captive Africans that did come from what is today the Gold Coast, because one of the things about the Spanish period, it sort of correlates with the expansion of European trade on the West and Central African continent. So you find that towards the end of the Spanish period, by that point, captive Africans were heading into Jamaica from various sites, as it was in other places in the Americas. In the British period, it was a more expansive trade. So you'll find that, but there are certain groups that dominate. So even though you'll find, for example, in the British period, you get captives that are referred to broadly as Chromanti. And Chromanti is another geographic term that was sort of used for captive Africans that were primarily of Akan extraction. However, you have a number of captive Africans that came from today, what is the Kalabari region in today's Nigeria, and the Bight of Biafra, also from today's Benin, in places like Wida and so forth. But what you tend to find in terms of cultural retentions, one of the things you find is that the culture of Afro-Jamaican people tends to have a visible Akan and Igbo presence. You tend to find those two cultural traits, in my estimation, from my research, those two cultural traits tend to sort of dominate. And that does not mean that the Kikongo did not contribute, because I think, as we had previously spoken, after the enslavement period ended, in 1840, there was a period of indentureship, and that brought a number of Kikongo Africans into Jamaica as indentured servants. And of course, that presence remained, and they remain in particular groups on the eastern side of the island, parishes like St. Thomas and Portland. You tend to find that they settle, but mainly in St. Thomas.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much for that. And going on that theme of where the Afro-Jamaicans originated from, the difference between, as well, can you describe for Obeah and Mayal, because that's where, in terms of those practices, originated from.
Yeah, you're right. So so to get into the center of our conversation, Obeah is a sort of generic terminology that is broadly used to describe African spiritual practices that were performed on the islands, and it is used up to this very day to describe, a large body of practices that resemble, what in people's imagination that they consider to be African spirituality. I take a different sort of approach with the term Obeah. A lot of scholars, you'll notice, they tend to argue that Obeah is a corruption of the Akan Obeah 4. Obeah 4 is used by the Akan peoples to describe witchcraft. However, I take a different turn, and I see it more as an Igbo word from the word Obi, which is kola nut. And the kola nut has a lot of significance in many African cultures. It is often seen as the mouthpiece of Almighty God, because they use it in for divinational purposes. So it's my estimation, my conclusion, that Obeah sort of developed on the plantation in reference to the spiritual practices that Africans utilize. And I sort of see it as a merger of another Igbo term, Diba. Diba is the Igbo word for priest. So I sort of see Obeah and Diba being a sort of fusion that gives the Afro-Jamaican and other Caribbean islands as well the terminology Obeah. So what you will notice is that by the time you get to the late 18th century, after the Taki rebellion in 1760, the term Obeah comes to the attention of the colonial officials. And the colonial officials, because of the association between Obeah and slave revolts, the colonial officials then begins to enact a series of legislation to outlaw Obeah practices. But one of the things that you'll find is that there's another terminology that is sort of utilized in the Afro-Jamaican spiritual complex, and that is Mayal. Yes. Mayal is largely a terminology that is sort of used to describe spirit possession. But what sort of seemingly develops within the enslaved period is that within the enslaved community, they seem to develop this need to distinguish Mayal from Obeah. And the thing about it is that because Obeah itself tends to more refer to what people call spiritual workings, the act of doing rituals in order to achieve a particular result. Whether or not you take two particular type of bush and you put it together and you speak certain things, right? So Obeah tends to deal with what in Jamaica we call science, right? The ability to utilize certain material objects to create an immaterial force that in turn will have a material effect. So literally it's the fusing of material objects, and even in today you can even utilize the people who work Obeah utilize the Bible as well, because Obeah is a practice that sees the ability to use material objects to have a spiritual effect that in turn would influence the material world. So because Obeah works like that, it is sort of like a gun. It is neither good or bad. It could be used for bad, but it also could be used for good. Like we have the enslaved rebellions. The Obeah man was central to all of the major slave revolts. But likewise, Obeah is also utilized to harm people. So one of the things that you will notice during the enslaved era, one of the things that you will notice is that they sort of developed a distinction by the enslaved Africans to distinguish Obeah from Bayal, because Bayal now is seen as spirit possession, communicating with heavenly bodies, possessing man, right? And so what you find is that Mayal now was seen as a sort of movement to eradicate bad. And Obeah, because Obeah has this sort of broad usage, it was also used for bad. So in many places in the enslaved community in Jamaica, they sort of developed this idea of Obeah being bad. And this sort of ties into the generic topic of our discussion, which centers on the paper, which centers around Guinea Jack. Guinea Jack was arrested and charged for Obeah, and he was a spiritualist, and he was a spiritualist that was part of the 1823 Boxing Day conspiracy in the parish of St. George's. The parish of St. George's is part of today's Portland. Yeah. So the thing about it is that when you look at the records for the trial for Guinea Jack, he objected to this idea of being called an Obeah man, right? He said his spirituality is to be used for good, right? So you'll notice that within the enslaved community, they tended to sort of be this need to sort of create this distinction away from Obeah. Now, there could be another reason. It could be based upon the fact that the colonial state had sort of deemed these practices illegal. So therefore, in order for enslaved Africans who were spiritualists to argue against the charges brought against them, they would say that what we are doing is not Obeah, but something different. So Obeah is a generic terminology, whereas Mayal, it deals with more spirit possession, but within the enslaved community, there's sort of this struggle. Likewise, even in today's Jamaica, there's this struggle to sort of how to define and place Obeah, because Obeah can be placed along the broad spectrum of good and evil.
Definitely. I would definitely agree with you on there. And I know that you just mentioned about the 1823 Boxing Day revolt. And I just wanted to, if you can just go through in terms of the rituals that were used and the structure and the organization of these meetings, planning it out. If you can just talk to that, because I know you mentioned that in the paper as well.
Yeah, one of the things, and this is why I always emphasize that when you're looking at certain periods in Jamaican history, you need to have a clear understanding of African culture and African society. Because one of the things that you'll notice with enslaved people on the plantation is that they continued many of the patterns. When you look at African states in the pre-colonial period, they had both a spiritual and a physical function. So usually part of any African state, there was always that were involved with the structure and the making of the state or the making of the nation. Likewise, even in their military units, like for example, when you look at the Akan Asafo groups, right, they have a convos, right, that have particular functions to perform in order to prepare the fighters for battle. Likewise, you will notice that every slave rebellion, not just in Jamaica alone, but if you look at Haiti with the Haitian Revolution, before the enslaved Africans went to war, they performed a series of rituals. One of the most popularly known was the Bois Cayman ceremony. Likewise, you'll notice in Jamaica, every rebellion, there was always a sort of spiritual preparation that would take place. You know, in the African context, they refer to this as cooking the battle, right? Meaning that weakening the enemy in order for you to have a sort of victory. And, you know, I'm going to get into that, but the thing about it is that when you even look, even as the enslaved population became creolized, and you look, for example, at the Sam Sharp Rebellion, even though he identified as a Baptist preacher, there was that similar spiritual preparation that was undertaken, right, before the war was launched. And even after emancipation, the last major revolt to take place, the 1865 Paul Bogle Rebellion, there was also a sort of spiritual preparation that would take place. So in reference to the 1823 Boxing Day, the Boxing Day conspiracy, the rituals that Guinea Jack performed, because he was enlisted, because in the parish he was a known spiritualist. He was not just a spiritualist that dealt medicine for war, but he dealt with a range of ailments within the parish. And for a number of years before actually being enlisted, he was actually a runaway, right? And he had actually set up a small encampment in the bush where he performed his spirituality. So one of the things that, there were several things that were done, and this is why it's fascinating when you look at the records, because one of the things that is mentioned in the records is that when he was apprehended, the colonial officials noted that in his possession were 4 wooden effigies and a mirror. And when you look at when you look into the West African space, mirrors is a central part of many divination practice. Through the mirrors, they tend to communicate with the spirit. You know, certain groups use water, like the Fantis and other Akan groups tend to use water. You know, when you get down to the Ewe and the Fan region, they tend to use the cowrie shells as a way to communicate with supernatural beings, right? But this, in this particular case, Guinea Jack was utilizing a mirror to communicate with the spirits that were represented by 4 wooden effigies. Now, the Europeans oftentimes label, you know, African practices as idol worship and so forth, but the wooden effigies are not a representation or portals, so to speak, through which to communicate with the spirit, right? So, so Guinea Jack was found that in his possession. So one of the things that you can infer, you know, from that mention of his ritual paraphernalia, so to speak, is that divination was one of the rituals that was performed. He also bathed the major leaders of the rebellion with particular bush. One bush was mentioned in the records, and that is sage. So usually, you know, bathing of the fighters was done, and usually there was this idea that there was certain medicine that could protect the fighters from being injured by bullets or so forth. And, you know, the last ritual he was not able to perform, but the last ritual that he was supposed to do entailed obtaining pieces of locks of hair from the leading white men in the parish, and he was going to place it in a coffin and then place that coffin in the crossroad. And when you look in spirituality, the crossroads is a central place to perform spiritual work.
Definitely. And of course, if you can just go into in terms of the planning of the revolt, because the structure of everything, they use the guise of religious meetings in order to do this. How important, you know, is that in terms of their structure?
Another thing, what was utilized is that the divination was utilized to know when to meet.
Yes.
So usually at night, they met in the cow pasture. And there were times when it was not safe for them to meet. And Guinea Jack was able to tell them through that divination. And you know, the irony of it is that today in Jamaica, there is a major trial that is taking place for a gang called the, I believe it is the One Order gang in Spanish Town. And on trial is one of the leaders called Black Man. And one of the things that is being discussed at the trial is the usage of a young man who identifies himself as an Obeah man, who's identified as an Obeah man or a spiritualist. And it is being reported in the trial that he alerted the gang when the police would be present and when they would not be present. Okay. So the thing is that this is 2022, right? And you see the continuation of this sort of practice of engaging with spirits in order to know when the authorities would be around and when they would not be around. So Guinea Jack, during that rebellion, was utilizing divination, right, in order to help the group to know when to plan and when not to plan.
Definitely. And then with the Bogle revolt, the rituals, again, there too, that was used, that you mentioned, there was an Obeah specialist as well.
Oh yeah, yeah. Arthur Wellington, right?
Yeah.
And I think there were two others that were also executed during that revolt. And you know, the interesting thing is that when you get a chance and you read through the records that surrounds that revolt, one of the things that you will notice is that there was a ritual.
Yes.
And this is one of the things I mean by that there's a sort of African, you know, continuum that exists in Jamaica that extends across time and space. Rebellion, one of the things that is performed in every rebellion, whether it was the rebellions that occurred during the enslaved era, or it was the Paul Bogle rebellion, one of the things is taking the oath, right? And when you think about African societies, the Ashantis, the Dincheras, the Oyo, and so forth, one of the things you notice is that oath, taking an oath, is very critical. And usually it's not just words and swearing, but you also eat the oath, right? So within Jamaica, one of the things that is utilized in the oath-taking ritual in both the Paul Bogle Rebellion and the rebellions during the slave period was the drinking of rum mixed with gunpowder. And so you will see that that was one of the clear identifying features to sort of say that, yes, you know, Paul Bogle's rebellion, so identified as a deacon in the Baptist tradition, in the Native Baptist tradition, there are elements in the Morant rebellion that clearly has an African cultural root. And you know, and there are many avenues to which this could take place, because by the time you get to the Paul Bogle rebellion, there was a large number of recent Kikongo peoples that had settled in the St. Thomas area. And in the records, it is noted that, you know, when he was in the company of these indentured Kikongo Africans, that Paul Bogle would speak a different language. So the question begs is if Paul Bogle had learned Kikongo from these indentured Kikongo servants that had came to Jamaica. And the question is that I saw to raise is that if he learned the language, then there also must have been a process of transference of ritual ideas from the Kikongos to Paul Bogle.
Definitely, definitely. And in your paper, you mentioned again with Obeah and Mayal not being stamped out, even with the dissenter religions sending their missionaries, such as the Baptists, Moravians, and the Methodists. And again, you've already talked about it was being seen as something bad. Even to current day, it's still being used. So would you say that, you know, this type of message in terms of anything from the African continent is seen as bad and backward, when in reality, this is, you know, part of our heritage and something that cannot be stamped out through religion?
Yeah, you know, culture is a very hard thing to displace. You know, you'll find that even amongst Afro-Jamaican families that tend to see themselves as more creolized and more, you know, westernized, you still notice, you know, that there is still some sort of African retention that takes place. You know, for example, you know, hear the dogs,
Yeah,
you hear the
that's
dogs
okay.
again. Yeah, and so, for example, the 9-9,
Yes.
you know, which is, you know, a burial custom, so to speak, is practiced across the wide economic spectrum in the Jamaican space. So one of the things you'll find is that culture is very hard to displace. So even when people people are, and if you look at the enslavement period, when people are Christianized, there are just certain cultural ways that African people worship that is fundamentally different than how Europeans tend to worship. One of the things about African spirituality, there is this concept of feeling the spirit.
Yes.
And they want to feel the spirit, because one of the things that you'll find that is a very central component of spiritual traditions in the West and Central African space is possession, the ability of man and God to occupy the same physical space. And so because of that idea is very, very much centered and very much present in Western Central African, in the Western Central African homelands that the bulk of Afro-Jamaican people come from.
Yeah.
You'll find that even during the conversion process, there was this emphasis placed on spirit, on feeling the spirit. And for many of the missionaries, the dogs are too loud?
No, they're fine. They're fine.
Okay. Even during for many of the missionaries, one of their critiques was that the enslaved population was reading the Bible wrong, because many of the enslaved people wanted to activate the spiritual identities of Old Testament saints. So they began this sort of process of interpreting the Bible, the biblical text, through a distinctively West and Central African spiritual lens. So you tend to find that because you find that African peoples tend to worship differently, that within churches that developed during that enslavement era, you tend to find that there was a different, sort of relationship to spirituality that is very much African and not necessarily European. And it is something that the missionaries could not displace. It's something that they wrote about. It's something that vexed them. However, it was not something that they could displace. Right? So they may have been able to tell the Africans to see Shango, to see Obatala, to see Adade Kofi and the various African deities as evil. But however, the theoretical idea of how Africans view spirit and spirituality, the Europeans could not displace that, and how Africans relate to spirit, and this idea that spirit has to give some sort of revelation in order for it to be real. You see, this is one of the things, like when you look at traditional African spirituality, one of the things that is used to measure the effectiveness of the deity, it's its ability to answer material problems in the here and now. And likewise, when you look at that, at the burden, you can put it that way, the burden that it's not just Afro-Jamaicans alone, but other Black groups in the diaspora. When you look at the burden that many of them place on the Spirit, on the Holy Spirit, and various Christian entities, is a similar concept to the same burden that they would place on the African deities. So you sort of see the transference of a uniquely and distinctive African cultural understanding of spirituality that survived the transition from being what you can say, being strictly adhering to African religious practices, and the transition to becoming Christian.
Definitely, because I know that in your paper you mentioned how some Afro-Jamaicans do use both in terms of
Yes.
both Christianity and their cultural heritage as well.
Yes.
So the other thing I wanted to ask about, because you mentioned as well in the paper in terms of the religious practices throughout the Caribbean, so such as and it being clumped together, such as Santeria, Vodiem, how different were these, and they're not the same as Obeah or Mael?
Right. The thing about it is that when you look at Santeria, when you look at voodoo, Santeria from Cuba, voodoo from Haiti, when you look at Candomblé from Brazil, you know, those societies are Catholic. And one of the things is that the enslavement in Catholic countries were different. The enslaved, unlike the British, you'll find that in the Portuguese Brazil, the French Haiti, and the Spanish Cuba, they allowed the Africans to hold their feasts and festivals, right? They allowed them to participate in the Catholic feast and festival. So and the fact that also because the Catholic Church, they have a hierarchy that is very much similar, right, to the African pantheon, where you have a central deity, and then you have a host of saints. So within those traditions, within those Catholic traditions, there was greater room for the Africans to amalgamate or associate their religious practices with Catholicism. And through that process, they were able to maintain many of the deities. When you look at the British and you look at the island of Jamaica, for example, you know, even though one of the things I argue, and one of the things that I sort of noticed is that there were deities that were being sort of worshipped within Obeah, because they always developed, one of the things that was discovered whenever they would arrest an Obeah worker, they will also find in his possession what they call what was being called by the time you get to the Paul Bogle rebellion, what was being called, you know, Obeah Pickaninny, which were these wooden effigies. So the existence of these wooden effigies suggests that late into the Paul Bogle period, that there continued to be the existence of African deities that were being, you know, honored by the Afro-Jamaican population. Now, there might be several, there might be variation based upon location. Now, of course, because, you know, St. Thomas, where the Paul Bogle Rebellion took place, you know, had received a huge amount of indentured servants after 1838 from Central Africa. That might explain why they had these effigies. Because when you look at Kikongo spirituality, the Nkisi, right, is largely an effigy, you know, whether made out of wood or iron, that represents a spiritual power. So in the records, when you discover or you meet the term Obeah Picnic, it more than likely may be in reference, right, to the Kikongo Nkisi, so to speak.
Okay, thank you. That's
Yeah, because one of the things is that when you get into the West African space, you know, various groups represent their divinities differently.
yes.
Some groups represent them through wooden effigies, others utilize medicine, herbs,
Yes.
right, and other material products, and they combine it and put it together and sort of create a receptacle to attract spiritual energy.
Definitely.
Okay, so So for example, amongst the Akan in Ghana, you know, many of the deities are sort of represented like that, forms of medicine. But other groups though, they tend to utilize wooden effigies and so forth to sort of represent the particular spirit.
Definitely. And I know that we've discussed a lot of the major points within the paper, but I just wanted to go back in terms of with Obeah and the people that had practiced it, that organization within these revolts played a major factor. And it wasn't just seen as how it's being played out as it was rather disorganized, but rather integral with their organization.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that you'll notice in the enslaved period,
Mhm.
you know, many of the revolts were structured to overthrow the plantation system and the entire state.
Yes.
So many of them were organized with a government in waiting. So for example, when you look at the Taki revolt in 1760, that revolt was organized with an entire governance structure that aligns very closely with the kingship system in today's Ghana, West Africa. And Taki, which is pronounced by the Akan people as Teche, um, he organized it in that way where each parish would have a sort of chief.
Yes.
Right? And it was very structured. It was structured in a sense of having a government in waiting that would replace, if they were successful, the European state that they were looking to actually displace.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. And in addition to that, in terms of with even in today's, as you mentioned earlier in the discussion, that Obeah, is still being practiced, even though
Yeah,
there are laws on the books outlawing
yes,
it. Um, and I think it goes to what you had mentioned before, in that it is integral. It's part of, Afro-Jamaicans' heritage, so to speak. So,
yes.
and right now, currently, I guess, you mentioned in the paper as well that some of the Maroon communities, it's still being practiced or still part of their traditions.
Yeah, the Maroons wouldn't necessarily refer to what they do as Obeah. They have
Mhm.
something called chromanti play,
Yes.
which is similar to like what in amongst the Akan they call the akom, which is more like a dance and spiritual possession, which is sort of similar to Mayal.
Okay.
Yeah, but Obeah is still in existence. I mean, it takes on a different form. It tends to, again, it centers around using material objects, right, to create a sort of spirituality that would have a material, produce a material result. So you tend to find that there are these sort of pharmacies in Jamaica. If you go to downtown in Kingston, you go to Spanish Town, you'll notice that there are these types of pharmacies. And you'll see where they have a list of chemicals, a list of different potions. And it's like, for example, someone would go to an Obeah man out here
Yes.
and they would give them a list of things that they need to get. So they will go with their paper, and when you observe these pharmacies, they will, and you go into these pharmacies and you observe, they don't call out the items that they want, They
Yeah.
will hand the paper to the person behind the counter, and
Yeah.
then they will go and pick out the items, and then the person would carry back the various items to the Obeah man, or they would already have the instructions as to how they should put it together, right? So that's one way. You find some Obeah workers don't necessarily utilize chemicals, they more utilize herbs
Yes.
and medicine, and they utilize Bible verses, right? Particular Bible verses they utilize and would read in conjunction with certain herbs in order to work for clients. So
Yes.
you tend to find that there is a mixture in terms as to how it works today, right? So Obeah still survives in terms of name, but I would sort of argue that it's different than the Obeah that sort of existed during the enslaved period, because in that period, there was this closer relationship, so to speak, with African spirituality. So what exists today is a continual usage and idea of spirituality, right? However, they tend to be more tapped into using spirits from the Bible, spirits from European texts, and trying to conjure these entities to create a particular effect on the material world.
Definitely. And as we kind of close out this discussion, what would you say, or what would you, provide to the listeners in terms of making that connection from history to present day, as to what would be, you would provide to somebody else to say, we need to look at things a little bit more open and not so narrowly focused?
Yeah, I would say that if you have the chance, visit West Africa, right? And spend time amongst um, spiritualists where the spiritual practices are still maintained. And, if you're from a Caribbean background, places like Jamaica, Haiti, Antigua, and so forth, one of the things you'll notice is that there are many similarities in how things are done, not even just from a spiritualist point of view, but even just from an everyday cultural point of view. So one of the things I always advocate for is for people, if they have the opportunity, to visit and spend time in West Africa, because that is the foundation of the cultural identity for African peoples, not just in Jamaica, but throughout the Western African diaspora. So spending time in the African on the African culture, on the African continent, is very critical, and understanding spirituality from that point of view. Because one of the things you'll notice is that herbs, knowing medicine, knowing particular bush is very central to the spirituality. And one of the things you also notice is that the idea of God plays a central role. So it's not just this idea of going out there and working with these spirits that are just out there in the universe, but it's the idea of being godly, the idea of being good, being an upright person. Because ultimately, when you think about African spirituality, it answers the same sort of questions that any other major religion seeks to answer, which is to provide people with a way to live a godly life and to be upright. And of course, like in any culture and in any society, there are people that have other intentions to work spirit, to do things that are bad. And that is purely, and that's not something that is peculiar to the African spiritual worldview. It is something that pervades any religious and cultural system.
Definitely. And thank you so much, Kofi, for coming on. I really do appreciate your time and to discuss your paper, and greatly appreciate it. So thank you so much.
It's not a problem.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.